If you have a unique human side to you and how you build relationships and who you are as a person and your story with being a really freaking good investor, if you put both together, you got magic.
On this week's episode, we're diving deep into the world of emerging managers and how they can successfully attract family office capital with Benedikt Langer, a thought leader in the LP and emerging manager space and the voice behind the popular newsletter Embracing Emergence. Benedikt has been making waves with his insights into why LPs should be paying more attention to emerging managers and the common misconceptions about emerging managers. Plus, we discuss the challenges LPs face when accessing top-performing GPs. We also discuss management fees, due diligence, and why fund-to-funds are such powerful tools for LPs looking to mitigate risk while still capturing outlier returns. On the family office side, Benedikt will share strategies for how emerging managers can resonate with family offices, communicate their passions, and build meaningful relationships. Now let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Benedikt Langer from Embracing Emergence. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Benedikt.
Thanks for having me, man. It's really good to be here.
Given that you have such a large following, I'm sure a lot of our audience knows a bit about you, but for some of our listeners who may not be as familiar with your writings, it would be great if we can get a brief background on yourself, where you grew up, your early career path, and how you ended up becoming such a thought leader in this emerging manager ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't know if I'm a thought leader, but I know I like to think. So I start with that. But just like many people I talked to, I kind of stumbled into the venture world a little bit. Was never a plan to land here, but I somehow arrived. I feel like I kind of climbed into the back window of venture by joining a family office. But originally I grew up in Germany. As my name kind of gives away. I'll probably hear a little bit of accent during the recording. But I met my wife, who is from the US, on a 500-mile pilgrimage that starts on the border of France and goes all the way to the ocean in Spain. And it's not what the song 500 Miles is about, but it kind of is. We were hiking the whole way. We met on day 2, and we just felt like we needed to get married, and we were each other's person on there. Just think about how many dates you have to go on, like how many coffee dates you have to go on to hike 10 hours a day with each other. So we went through everything. We were both sweaty, and there were just no layers, no veils in front of us. So 4 months later, I proposed. 4 months after that, we got married. And that's kind of how I ended up in the US. The plan was to live in Germany together. But during our engagement, I went over for a visit during my university time. And I arrived March 13th, 2020, which is the exact day that the borders closed during COVID. So I got stuck. We decided to stay. We moved to Dallas together. We were married. And I met a family office in Dallas, which is the Sutton family office, which I then joined. They just had their liquidity event a year or two before I joined. So we were still super early in the formation of a family office, which was a huge privilege for me because I got to partake in those learnings that we had, which is a lot when you start a family office. They originally had the largest financing company for tech in the US that was independently owned. So not by a bank or anything like that. So the transition to staying in tech and investing in it was relatively organic if you look at a family office. So we did venture. We did a little bit of early stage direct investment ourselves. We made decent investments, but not as good of investments as we did in funds. We were much more aligned as an LP. That led us down the path to looking at emerging manager funds, which I'm sure we're going to dive into. But the way I would say I started to get more out there was as we were learning about our family office and building it, the veil of mysticism around family offices does not just affect the people raising from it, but affects the people who are building one too. We didn't have, or at least me trying to develop strategies, I didn't have the access to knowledge and frameworks that I thought I could have. So I just started writing about what we were doing, what we were thinking, and why we were doing things the way we did. And I believe it just resonated with a few people because it gave a little bit more transparency to the family office space. And I like people who move from generalist to specialist. I think that's a good movement. We invested in emerging managers who kind of follow that movement as well. So I just started to drill down in the niche of emerging managers and LPs, which believe it or not, 4 years ago, it was more of a niche than even now. And now just put together this newsletter, I put together a community for LPs to talk to each other, to share learnings. Just, I believe in the space, and I believe we need more transparency and peer-to-peer education too.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that amazing story. And obviously we'll get into the newsletter and stuff, but hold on. I want to just ask, what was that moment though, when you and your wife were like, or future wife, but new person in life that you met, was the moment you realized you wanted to marry her? Like, did you catch her or save her from falling off the side of a cliff? Like, what was the moment that you actually got to see each other's, like the whites of their eyes and say like, you are my forever?
So it's a really unique experience. I put my phone away. I went completely by myself, just with a backpack. And you reflect a lot. And this thought of a new fear came up of leaving and knowing what a special person she was, and just this fear of missing out on that life. I just shared that with her. And we had, like, I think after 7 days, I asked her to be my girlfriend, which is crazy. But we were on this cross. We just hiked 15 miles, top of the hill, looking west, sunset. And I was like, yeah, this is probably the appropriate moment to ask your future wife. So that was the journey. If you know, there's no wasting time.
That's amazing. Well, I will definitely end on this. I always believe that everyone should take a few months away from either school or life and go backpack wherever in the world with nothing. I did that myself when I graduated university. It was some of the best moments of my life. So kudos to you and your wife. You've been writing on Beehive lately under the newsletter called Embracing Emergence. And your initial few posts were about the case for emerging managers and why LP should be considering them, which you obviously have experience about. This is something that's obviously something we hold dearly at Ripple Ventures as an emerging manager ourselves. But you've done some amazing research on this space, and the focus on that is what I want to talk about today. So first off, what is some common misconceptions that LPs have about investing in emerging managers, and how do you try to address those?
My personal opinion at the moment where we're at right now is that the biggest misconceptions are being cleared up and that we're slowly moving past them. For example, emerging managers are more risky. The return profile of emerging managers is not as attractive as with more established funds. I believe we are slowly getting the data and the conversations that are needed to move past those, which when we started was a little bit different. Now I believe the problem I'm most passionate about is actually helping LPs think through how to actually underwrite emerging managers and help emerging managers understand themselves a little bit better and how to get their value across to LPs. I believe there's just this slight disconnect still between understanding each other's stories and using the right language for each other. The misconceptions, I'm pretty hopeful we're slowly getting past that. So I believe, and I hear that more and more, and there's more LPs joining the community around emerging managers. People have heard the voice screaming in the desert of like, hey, this is the pathway forward. And I can see more and more people coming to that.
It's interesting to hear you say this, because this has taken me some time to learn as a GP and as an LP myself, but it's kind of like aligned with that founder market fit analogy, where there's this LP GP fit as well. And so one size does not fit all. LPs have various reasons for why they invest in venture capital and then why they would choose emerging managers. And emerging managers have different reasons for why they want to do what they're doing. And those two reasons don't always align. And sometimes they don't have a one size fits all, meaning like some LPs are purely financially driven. Some are more strategically driven or relationship driven. And you can't have this sort of like one size fits all stamp on all of it. But you speak about the concept of embracing complexity benefits with LPs. And when evaluating emerging managers, what exactly do you mean by that?
So I think every business that's good is simple and complex at the same time. And I think emerging managers offer exactly that. Their value proposition is pretty straightforward, but for an LP to assess them and to execute well on the strategy, that is something very difficult to do. Look, you don't have to embrace the complexity, but if you want to be a top decile LP, I think you need to. And the complexity lies in holding the tension of emerging managers are not your established fund that will show you the track record of, hey, here's repeated success over time. The track record is something more complex with emerging managers, and that's where the disconnect is with how to assess them. The concept of embracing emergence is emergence means the sum of the parts is larger than the parts themselves. So when the parts come together, they have a function they can't execute by themselves. And for me, the parts of an emerging manager are profession and what I call humanness. And humanness is how you were brought up, your emotional and behavioral patterns, the depth and width of your intellect. I ask sometimes emerging managers how they were brought up by their parents, or I ask them about their insecurities and their fears or what they're passionate about. I try to understand their value system of how they perceive the world. And then you obviously have the professional side, which can mean their career path. Are they perceived as an expert in the industry they invest in? The professional side is what a lot of established funds offer. Their humanness side doesn't matter that much. But with emerging managers, both matters. And I think a lot of LPs are good at assessing the professional side, and we can learn and be better at holding the complexity of putting both together. But when I look at the best emerging managers I know, they clearly combine both worlds. And if they combine both, the function and the execution of both is something that they couldn't do by themselves. So if you have a unique human side to you and how you build relationships and who you are as a person and your story, with being a really freaking good investor and having or operating your zone of genius, if you put both together, you got magic. If you only look at one, you may have a decent fund. Yeah,
it's so true. It's like, I didn't know a lot of this, obviously, in our first few funds. And I went into every sort of LP pitch the same way, focusing on performance and portfolio construction. And obviously, you learn over time that that's not necessarily the first thing people want to hear about. It's your upbringing, your human interactions, your, founder references. But it's interesting, if we only had those top performing GPs who are today top performing share with us what it was like on their first few funds with those first LPs that took a chance on them, what they were looking at and what they judged them on. Could new LPs entering the space today look at today's emerging managers the same way, instead of comparing them to the top performing GPs of today who were emerging when they first got started? A lot of LPs are trying to access those top performing GPs directly. That's a challenge, though. And also, when comparing emerging managers to those top performing GPs is kind of a misguided signal. What advice would you have for LPs who are trying to access top performing GPs directly and also comparing them to the emerging fund class?
I would encourage people to really assess whether or not it's the most efficient and the most promising pathway forward to invest in the established GPs versus the emerging managers. And I believe if you're an LP, you can find a unique edge for your portfolio to focus on the emerging manager funds. There's different challenges, but I think most LPs overestimate the amount of access they can have to the top GP funds that are currently out there, and they underestimate their ability to access the best emerging managers and actually pick them. And I think if you gain more clarity around that, many people will realize, wait a moment, the portfolio that I can build of emerging managers with the return, I should focus more on that versus the established funds, considering that the probability of access to established funds is significantly low.
Right. Yeah. Put your attention on the ones that you can get access to without selection bias that you think will have the top performing returns as well. You speak about, obviously, the complexity and the benefits of that with emerging managers. What do you think are the most overlooked aspects of the due diligence process that LP should focus on when working or talking to emerging managers for an investment?
I would genuinely ask, so the way I think about due diligence is the job of the LP is to ask questions that reveal value in hidden places. If you want to assess and do due diligence on an emerging fund, your questions need to be targeted in a way that you find value that is not obvious. That can mean you start understanding the behavioral decision-making patterns of an emerging manager, because those things are not on a deck. Like the obvious values, they need to be stated regardless, and every LP will be able to look at those. But if you want to be one of the best LPs, you need to find that value that you're looking for in hidden places. If it's not there, it's not the right fit. So, for example, one question I like to ask that reveals that a little bit is, when you look at an investment decision, does your green light typically come on? Or are you somebody who constantly has a no and you have to build up to a yes? Or are you somebody who has a yes and you need to tear down your yes to get to a no? And that's typically a good conversation opener to understand how people think. Are they more of a gut-driven person or not? So these are questions that I believe give me more confidence in an emerging manager, but they're less obvious. But if I have confidence, I found that value in the less obvious places, I have more confidence in my decision as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's focus on the professional side. What things do you see emerging managers who are trying to prove their uniqueness and their value do to showcase people like you that they are really experts in what they're doing? Is it some of the insights they share, some of the innovative startups that they're coming across? Like, what kind of value do you need to see from an emerging manager to prove their professionalism and their, uniqueness?
Let me give a concrete example, and that's an unsolicited shout out. There's a defense manager out there. His name is Mark Scianna. He was one of the first employees at Palantir, was a forward deployed engineer. He shared stories of how he was deployed, operating on site, but he just had this experience of pure velocity of what's now a prime in the defense space. And he clearly now connects the dots from that experience of his career to being a GP. For example, he tracks velocity of, if a founder gives him an update, hey, this is what we're going to work on. He tracks the velocity of how quickly they get that done. So it's one thing to pitch your experience. It's another thing to connect the dots of that experience to how you're applying that now. If you don't connect the dots, you're just selling. If you connect the dots, you're pitching.
And is that easy for you as an LP to understand? Even though obviously the GP knows exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it. But from an LP's perspective, do you think they really can understand those unique characteristics that a GP has?
I believe we can learn it. I believe it takes repetition. So we always said when we started, we were tasting wine, water, and coffee at the same time to figure out what wine was. And then you start testing the wine next to each other. It's, for example, a school teacher, when they look at a child, they see your child like this. You see your child like this. It is good to have spectrum. That's why being an LP in emerging managers is a lot of work, and it is not easy. That's somewhere, if you want to be more time efficient, that's something where fund of funds can come in. But if you really want to be good at finding the value in hidden places, looking professional side, all those things, I would recommend getting a spectrum and doing a lot of calls and practicing your questions and how you assess the data that you get from them.
Oh, I got to ask, how many emerging manager pitches have you had over your career?
I mean, I would say we're probably at 1,000, somewhere around there.
Okay, so you've now, that's like what we tell our employees when it comes to like looking at the best founders to back. Until you've met with 1,000 founders, you don't know what good and greatness looks like, because everything you see looks great in the beginning. You
got to know what wine is before you can start talking about it.
That's amazing that you've had 1,000 emerging manager pitches. So obviously, my next question would be, okay, so after 1,000 pitches, what are the key factors that you have seen now in the highest potential performers in emerging managers that you've met with that you think are key for other emerging managers to make sure they have?
They build a firm. They don't build their brand. They are commercially minded. I always associate the best ones with the name of their firm and not with their personal name. They are scrappy in Fund 1, and they don't hesitate. There's no shame of sharing that scrappiness. Daniel Kimmerling is another good GP. He says the best investors are 50% manager, 50% consultant, and 50% rabbi. They have all those. And another thing he said is, if you want to be a good investor, you have to be an effective thinker, effective writer, and work fucking hard. So those are good lenses that I think the best investors all put together. But it's another element of complexity, right? It's not either or. It's not just this. It's not just two of the three. You have to have all of it all at the same time. It should be impossible to be really good emerging manager.
Yeah, I agree with all three of those. I mean, I'll take the rabbi out and put in motivational speaker.
Yeah, it's whatever you want to exchange that with.
I would say fund manager. So managing actually people and like the fund management process, and being a great networker and connector of dots is super important, especially in pre-investment and then post-investment. You talk about the influence to investment ratio in your writings, and it's significant in fund investments. What do you mean by that?
So when we were investing directly as a family office specifically, in order to get a seat at the table that gives you a voice in the best startups, you pay a premium that you can be sensitive to if you're a family office. Versus if you invest in an emerging fund, the ratio of how much your voice is being heard for the capital that you invest versus with a startup that's a sought after startup and raising funds. It's just so significantly different that if you want a relationship that also influences your own practice, I would recommend go with the emerging manager route that are insightful. You get learnings. You can have a direct feedback loop with some of the best GPs, and you get learnings from their spectrum of looking at the 1,000 companies that you talked about, right? Versus me having to do all that. It's a more efficient way if you're looking for learnings and for your voice being heard to use your capital to be a better investor.
It's so interesting that's the way you described it, because that's how we got started, which was I was an angel investor running my own personal family capital, investing in startups. A bunch of family offices saw the success I was having with my own capital, and the sons or daughters that I was friends with introduced me to the parents who were running the family office and said, hey, my mom and dad want to sit down with you because we've been doing a lot of direct investing in startups that come through our network, and we have no fucking clue what we're doing. Can we hear how you do it? And then they realize, wait, we can have investments done through someone who spends 1,000 hours on this, use their due diligence, use their structure, use their learnings, and still have exposure with obviously the influence that comes with the capital they commit to the GP. And the relationship started off that way, and Fund 1 has now gone all the way through to Fund 3. But it's so interesting. You call it the influence to investment ratio. I'm going to probably take that one if that's okay.
Go over it. I don't mind at all.
Now, how do you go about cultivating relationships with emerging managers just to ensure that there's mutual trust and strategic alignment besides that influence to investment ratio you talked about?
Trust builds trust in relationships, right? So I think for LPs, it's also important to show that you trust the emerging manager. That can mean sharing like your goals with the investment. That can mean even sharing your concerns with investing in emerging managers. That can mean making introductions to other LPs. I would just recommend people to, just as much as the emerging manager needs to trust the LP needs to trust the emerging manager, and trust begets trust. That's just the magic of any relationship. So whatever you can communicate that trust with as an LP, I would recommend to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, transparency and authenticity in our reporting, which we've been told by our LPs is some of the best reporting out there in the funds they're invested in. And that comes down to sharing as much as you can without oversharing. That becomes complicated. And also have a frequency of communication and not just communicate once a year in an annual letter or something. We just sent out our AGM report, which we did in person. But for those who couldn't make it in person, we sent a video recording and a summary with a presentation as well, because we know that not everyone could attend in person. And I think that's also beneficial as well for building trust. You talk about fund of funds and why they're important and beneficial for LPs, especially newer LPs looking at investing in emerging managers. Explain to us why fund of funds are important and how they can maybe help mitigate risk while still capturing outlier returns in venture capital.
So if you look at a Preqin report and you look at vintages 2014 or older, you can see top quartile returns for fund of funds at 3.3, 3.5x net returns plus and 25% IRR plus. Which, when we looked at that, I was like, wait a minute. For us to, first of all, to generate that return investing directly, being a top quartile investor as a family office, very, very, very difficult to do. Maybe not even recommendable, unless depending on your experience as a direct investor. Doing that with a portfolio of funds, much easier, much more de-risked. You just spread your capital across various startups, various industries, various geographies. Your early stage, just because emerging managers, the fund size and where they come from, that's typically where they're at. if you're an LP who just doesn't have the wine, coffee, water tasting done yet, but you want to get access to it, fund of funds are probably the most recommendable way to do it if they have a unique edge. Because I think learning to invest in emerging managers, you can most likely do over time yourself. But for example, if there's a fund of funds who anchors a fund one before any other institutional capital, there is something that you most likely won't do, but that you will 100% learn from and get a unique experience from. So fund of funds, the way I think about it is equal returns, if not better, than the own portfolio that you could build. Much more de-risked because the capital gets spread in a better way. More learnings because now you learn from various sources all at the same time. But I would value the learnings differently depending on the edge that a fund of funds provides.
Right. No, but sourcing and selecting, fund of funds and venture capital is a lot different, though, than obviously one sourcing emerging managers directly. But also there's different kinds of fund of funds out there. There's like very specific, like Sundana, like early stage seed focused emerging manager fund of funds, Slipstream. But then there's also the larger platform fund of funds out there, like the Stepstones and stuff, Sapphires. How do you differentiate between those as an LP looking at sourcing and selecting the right fund of fund for your unique needs?
With any LP, it's not just about the cost effectiveness for the returns that you can get. It's about the effectiveness, about the amount of capital you have to deploy and what buckets of assets and the ratio that you have to deploy. So that's pretty unique for every LP. For us, we like specificity more than scale, just because we want those hands-on learnings that we then can implement ourselves. It depends on the LP, but a good motivation can be to move from fund to funds into your own practice, because there is a possibility to build that portfolio yourself and take a layer of fees off, even though some fund of funds provide a 1 on 10, so it can be a wash depending on what fees they get with the GP. But I would personally say if you're relatively new to investing in emerging managers, look for the Slipstreams, look for the pattern ventures, look for the more smaller fund of funds who provide you a unique edge. Allocator One is a great one. If somebody's listening, you want to talk to one of those, I'm happy to.
Yeah, we can connect you with Alex or Kyle.
That's right.
Mike, they're all great, great fund of funds for the space, supporting and having a ton of data to share and thought leadership as well for people to get caught up to speed. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about like the direct side and the co-investment side and how that overlays with the investment philosophy at the family office. Do you look at co-investments or direct investments first off anymore, or is it purely just an LP and funds?
Purely LP. And I'm starting to hear more repeatedly that a few LPs also actually don't really care about the access to directs, which maybe because they were burned 2021, 22.
Right. Is that the 2021 time period burnt them forever? Yeah, we'll see it in 10 years again.
It's just, we have learned our alignment is maximized as an LP, and it's a little bit minimized as a direct investor. Regardless, if we get the benefit, there's clear benefits to getting direct access. They're de-risked. You get to make use of the due diligence the GP already made, or the fund of funds, whichever case. You get to pick most likely the winners of the portfolio. There's great benefits. It's just for us, we just try to stay disciplined. If this is what we're really good at, this is what we're going to keep doing.
Right. So let's switch gears again to the family office side. You've seen over 1,000 pitches. You've obviously understood the difference between water, coffee, and wine. What should an emerging manager learn about a family office before going into the journey of pitching them so that they become more equipped and prepared, knowing how to pitch that specific family office? What kind of due diligence or reverse due diligence should they be doing on the family office?
It depends a little bit of if the family office website is just the logo, which is pretty common. It just depends on how much out there the family office is, which was another value, but just writing about our family office, it just gets you a lot of deal flow and you get seen. But if you can't figure that out before the first call, rule number 1, never pull out your deck on the first call. Have a conversation. I made a survey with LPs, and 100% of all LPs who answered said no deck.
I would agree.
And I made a survey with emerging managers, what's more fruitful, deck or no deck? And first call, it was no deck, 75%. But it gives you opportunity to find alignment in the right places. And I think alignment always leads to fruitfulness. Finding the alignment, it depends. You can ask, hey, what generation are you currently in with the family office? If you're still in the first three, it is very, very likely that entrepreneurship is held up high, which means you can emphasize your scrappiness. It can emphasize how frugal you are, how quickly you try to operate, all those things. You just emphasize your entrepreneurship and your journey with that. If you're pitching the Dyson family offices in our LP community, like there's some more engineering background that you already know will come with that. Try to find the obvious things, like ask obvious questions. I think family offices like to share their story and their journey, and alignment means people resonate with you and they identify with you. And typically first gen or second gen is still involved, and they still remember that liquidity event, but they also remember how they got there. They want to help you get there too.
Yeah, I completely agree. Share the passion, the sacrifices with, if you can get to Gen 1, which is incredible, sharing that alignment on the values of where the family office got its creation from an entrepreneurial start likely. Real estate families are a little bit harder to kind of figure out exactly where they are. But in terms of entrepreneurship family offices, it's a lot easier.
To the point of like your story and the sacrifice and your passion, if you just pitch that about yourself, you're selling again. If you pitch that about, hi, I am going through this and I've gone through this and I know you've gone through this. So let's connect the dots and now we know what we need to look for in the people that I invest in. If you transfer that to your strategy of, I look for founders who are scrappy, I look for founders who know how to win, I look for founders who operate with sheer velocity, because that's how I operate. That's how you used to operate. That just, now you're drawing the line all the way to the end, because ultimately as an LP, I underwrite a person who underwrites another person. And I need to know how you think about people in order for me to get comfortable, because you're an emerging manager. The probability of you investing in early stage where the team's crucial is, close to 100%. It never is, but it's very high. So you transferring your passion, your sacrifice, your story to the people that you invest in, that will create the most alignment, I believe.
Yeah, one piece of advice I've learned is that, the alternative investing space at large is over 50% sometimes of a family office portfolio. But within alternative investing, venture capital is still a pretty small pool. Sometimes it could be 5%, maybe 10%. So my favorite thing to do is, besides asking them, where the family got their start, tell me the stories and stuff, is why are they even interested in this space? Where else in the alternative space have you gotten exposure to an experience, and why do you like it? What do you not like about it? Why is venture capital even something you're spending time learning about, or other managers that you've met with? So I can explain maybe the difference in who we are versus some of the others that you met with, is a thing that I've learned to go over in the first few conversations as well, just to get a sense of whether or not there's even a fit here. And if there's not, we can save each other some time to understand, maybe you're more private equity or hard asset or infrastructure focused. This is not that asset class. And, maybe in a couple of years after you got your feet wet, will venture capital fit the model for what the family office is building?
How many emerging managers do you think just ask questions about just the obvious of like, hey, why is this a good fit? Why are you doing venture? Why are you interested?
Well, from my experience in raising Fund 1, I was always selling, and it was a bad process I learned from, and now I don't sell. But I would say Fund 1 managers, it's very unlikely that they ask questions about the family office reasoning for, investing. And then maybe by time Fund 2, and then definitely by Fund 3, if you've made it there, you're asking those questions. But on Fund 1s, it's probably less common than you think.
I think you're right. I think that's a fair way to put the evolution.
Your experience of storytelling is super important. You told us an incredible story at the beginning of this conversation. What role do you think storytelling plays in pitching family offices, and how should people think about creating a compelling story when meeting them for the first time?
I read this book by Charles Taylor, who's a philosopher I really like. He called the book Man, the Language Animal. And it just brings the point across that language is how we create meaning. Language is what builds the life around us. The allegory I like to tell emerging managers in helping them think about pitching their story is Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, which is arguably one of the best English novels of all time. He got really obsessed with language at a very young age. He read mystical poems in ancient languages, which inspired the world that he created around The Lord of the Rings. And if you read the books, even if you just watch the movies, the language that he uses, the language he created for the elves, the names that he gives people and places, you just enter that world and you can imagine what it's like. Imagination sparks you being able to create alignment as an LP with the emerging manager. And let's say you as an emerging manager fund, a person who does this really well is Erica Wenger, who created the elephant thesis. If you create language around your story that is consistent and you just continually use the same language, it helps me as an LP imagine what the first call is with a founder for you. It helps me imagine what you look for in people. So if you say, I look for elephant founders, not unicorn founders, because they walk in herds, because they have big ears and they're good listeners. You're not really nailing down what you look for, but you're giving me language to imagine it. And I think the right language that sparks my imagination is the best way to tell your story. And if people haven't read Tolkien, you should, because not just because it's a good story, but I think it will make you it will create a better pitch.
That's amazing advice. Do you ever think that GPs, emerging managers, should use the same pitch they use on founders when pitching them about their fund and why they should potentially work with them as they should with family offices? Because I often think that wouldn't resonate with a family office who may not be a founder, but maybe I'm wrong.
That's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer. My intuition would be adapt the pitch to the customer, and the customer is different with LPs than founders.
I think bits and pieces of it probably make sense. Intertwining those anecdotes is what I would do, and how the founder's conversation can overlap with a family office entrepreneur background. But again, it does have it's hard to separate the transactional part of the relationship sometimes. And that's why you can't have the perfect aligned story with a founder pitch and a family office pitch. But, can you tell us a little bit about the process at the family offices that you've seen and worked with on, assessing potential investments, the sort of process they go and sort of stack ranking them and which ones make it finally through the end of the day?
I mean, the famous saying is if you've met one family office, you've met one family office, right? But I'm slowly starting to get sick of that saying, and I hope we can move past that when it comes to investing in emerging managers. Okay, best allegory is how an emerging manager goes through with a fund. Oftentimes, depending if they have an associate or something, typically first called with that kind of person, and the decision slowly moves up. That's typically the same process within a family office. You may be already talking to a decision maker, but typically the decision is most likely not made alone. So there's somewhat of a meeting, there's somewhat of a process to get to that yes or no. And that's where it's crucial, if you're pitching the family office, to give the person that you're pitching to the right language to represent you. Because if you do not do a good job at your initial conversation or just pitching about your fund and how you talk about it, most likely the person in the family office that's now going to the internal meeting is going to make up their own language about your fund. And they may not be representing you in the way fully that you actually realistically represents the value that you have. So make sure you have that nailed down and give the right language that is sticky and that the person can remember and bring up. I mean, hey, we made a lot of decisions walking. We were a little bit more scrappy. We're still learning. We were making decisions, just talking about it, walking with each other, being out in nature, talking through things. There may not always be the conference room table where you throw the slides on and talk about it. There may be sometimes more philosophical approaches. Sometimes it's more rigorous. Sometimes it's more corporate. But I think you can tell that really, really quickly in the first call.
Yeah, it's like the Steve Jobs go for a walk around the building, right? And think about a solution. Or go for a 500-mile hike across the French border. And then you'll find your next LP.
My wife if she thinks it's good.
Exactly. Last question I was going to ask you is, what do you hope to become of the newsletter Embracing Emergence? And where did you think it would go when you started? And how has that changed over the time that you've been making these amazing posts?
The reason why I started writing is because I wanted to get better at it. And every time I write, it helps me understand something about myself. So I primarily wrote for myself, and I never assumed that people actually care what I say. Now that, we have a 70% open rate. We're over 1,000 subscribers. Now I'm like, okay, I guess people do read it.
I definitely care what you say. So that's one person too.
I appreciate that. So now my goal is for this to be the number one platform where both emerging managers and LPs can come together and they can find convergence. Because like we said at the beginning of the call, I think we're moving past the problems of, hey, emerging managers are a good opportunity, to how the heck do you actually underwrite one? And if you're an emerging manager, how should you approach an LP? So I want this to be a place where we can all talk to each other. I want this to be a place where, we've had this, an emerging manager was guest writing, an LP was guest writing. I'm currently working on potentially putting on a debate between two emerging managers. One is going to defend their concentrated portfolio approach. Another one's going to defend their more shots on goal approach. And I want this to be like a proper scientific debate.
I'll take the other side for sure.
All right. Okay, yeah. You have the first candidate. I just want to host things that help people think. And then I want to also move forward to like providing practical tools. But I believe in peer-to-peer communities. And one thing we've done is we just put together a group for LPs, only LPs who invest in emerging managers, and to talk to each other. I've sort of put together a survey for LPs to ask them what they look for in quarterly updates and emerging managers. I want this to become the number one resource for emerging managers to become better at what they do and just solve the freaking inefficiencies that we have, because many are just unnecessary.
Yeah, I love that. I share it with all of our LPs in Ripple. I've shared it with them. And I've actually created something called Ripple LP Connect, where when an LP gets onboarded into Ripple, they fill out like an Airtable on their likes and habits or stuff. And we connect LPs together on things that they're interested in, whether it's healthcare, or crypto, or real estate. And they can have their own personal relationship about, going for coffees and dinners and talk about sports cars or whatever, because I believe that there needs to be more alignment or just connections between the LPs inside a fund. It should not be isolated. One thing, if I do the debate, I want hot mics available though. So hot mics have to be turned on. No turning off of hot mics, okay? No
hot mics for all attendees or hot mics between the two?
Hot mics for all attendees might get spicy, but hot mics between the two debaters. No Kamala Harris quiet mics and stuff.
I'm envisioning, and I'm doing this probably with my good friend David Jew, who's amazing at his podcast for LPs too. We want like 15 minutes. You can pitch why this is the way. Both do that. You have crossfire examination. You have Q&A from people who attend. Think about this like the UFC for emerging managers and LPs.
I love that. That's fantastic. Well, before we wrap things up, we always ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
Pints with Aquinas. It's if you could grab a beer with Thomas Aquinas, what would you talk about?
I have no idea. Is that what it's called?
That's what the podcast is about. That's the whole concept.
That's so cool. I got to check that out. Favorite newsletter or blog?
It's called The Abbey of Misrule. It's about mysticism and wonder in our own personal life.
Who writes it?
Oh, I would come up with a name right now. Can't tell you.
Okay, we'll find it out for you.
That's another thing. I know the name of the thing more than I know the person.
Fair enough. Next is your favorite tech gadget?
My AirPods, phone calls.
Yeah, live with those. Next is your favorite new trend?
Marketing is moving from attention-based to thoughtfulness-based, and I prefer that much more.
Oh, I love that. That's the first time we've heard that. Fantastic idea. Next is your favorite book?
Blaise Pascal, Pensées, probably the best book ever written.
And last but not least, your favorite life lesson?
Shout out to my dad. Always do the uncomfortable things first in life.
Oh, that's amazing. Like going on a 500-mile hike to find your loved one. Fantastic. Thanks for joining us in the tank today with Benedikt Langer from Embracing Emergence.
Thanks so much, man. It was great.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tank Talks. We hope you found today's conversation as insightful as we did. If you're enjoying the show, we've got 3 quick things to ask of you. First, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or YouTube. Next, follow us and stay up to date on upcoming episodes and behind-the-scenes content on social media with Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And lastly, share the love. If you found value in today's episode, share with a friend or colleague who'd benefit too. Your support helps us bring in more amazing guests and keeps the Tank Talks engine running. That's it for today. Until next time, keep disrupting and innovating.